Tonight, our story drifts not into glittering halls of kings or grand castles, but toward the overlooked corners of history, the places never painted or sung about. Here we'll walk beside medieval peasants, men and women without crowns, without horses, without names written in records. They carried no titles, left behind no monuments. Yet they endured plagues, hunger, and the long grind of labor with a quiet strength most of us could hardly imagine. If you find comfort in slow, steady tales, let this one ease you. Dim the lights, settle in, and listen as we step into a village lost to maps and memory. Its name, if it ever had one, has been forgotten. Nestled in a shallow valley, it hides from roads and rulers, existing in a crease of the land where the forest begins and the world seems to end. You've never seen a map. You don't need one. The village is bounded by the trees, dense and patient, as if ancient woods merely tolerate human presence. The fields are patches of soil, worked past exhaustion and then worked again. To the north, they say, lies a river, spoken of with the same uncertainty as saints or dragons. This place is both your cradle and your grave. The distance between the two no more than a few dozen steps. The houses lean and sag, battered by countless winters. Their walls are a patchwork of mud, straw, and sticks, repaired endlessly by tired hands. Thatch roofs bow beneath their own weight, dripping where you can't quite reach. The air smells of damp wool, smoke, earth, and livestock. The road leading in isn't really a road at all, just muddy grooves filled with rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has come this way in years, perhaps ever. Time itself feels vague here. Sometimes you hear a distant chapel bell carried on the wind. Other times, the sun and your aching spine are the only clocks you trust. A dozen families fill the village, everyone knowing everyone else, and knowing more than they say aloud. Leadership belongs to Tom, an old man who once spoke to a monk and now repeats the story often enough that no one bothers to argue. His goat looks healthy, his house still stands. That's enough to make him wise. Here, life is measured not by maps or deeds, but by landmarks past the old elm, or where the soil softens underfoot. A quarrel might be settled with a shrug, or perhaps a loaf of bread passed back and forth until neither side wishes to argue further. There is no inn, no tavern, no school. Strangers are rare enough to be spoken of for weeks, both feared and fascinating. Leaving is even rarer. Stories of cities with tall stone houses and busy markets sound more like fairy tales than real destinations. And so, you stay, because routine, even with leaking roofs and thin stew, is safer than the unknown. For a medieval peasant, eating was never about pleasure. Food was survival, repetitive, limited, and rarely enough. What you had was a problem to solve each day with whatever scraps the land or luck provided. At the heart of nearly every meal was pottage, a stew that never truly ended. It simmered endlessly in a blackened pot by the hearth, receiving bits of barley, beans, cabbage, or onions when they were available. A bone, if fortune allowed, might flavor it for days until nothing remained but the memory of meat. It was rarely new, never finished, and never exciting, but it was warm, and warmth kept you alive. Bread stood beside the stew, though it was no soft, golden loaf. It was hard, heavy, and dark, baked from rye, oats, or barley. Wheat was for the wealthy. Peasants could barely imagine it. A stale hunk could serve as a plate, soaking up stew until it was eaten or tossed to animals. In the worstures, bark or weeds were ground into flour to stretch a harvest. That bitter famine bread broke teeth, but it kept bellies from collapsing entirely. Meat was rare. Chickens were more valuable alive for eggs, cows for milk. To slaughter an animal was a decision of desperation. When it happened, nothing went to waste. Fat, organs, even blood found their place in the pot. Pork was the most common, though only when a pig had to be killed and salted for winter. Fish offered another chance, but rivers and lakes often belonged to the Lord, and fishing without leave could cost more than hunger. The church shaped the menu, too. Meat was forbidden on Fridays and throughout Lent, pushing diets toward fish or simply thin bowls of vegetables. Sometimes even beaver tails were declared fish just to ease hungry consciences. Milk soured quickly, so it was churned into butter or pressed into hard cheese when possible. Both were luxuries. Spoiled milk was used anyway. You cut away the mold, whispered a prayer, and hoped your stomach was stronger than the sickness inside it. As for drink, water was uncertain, so most people turned to weak ale. A brew so low in alcohol even children drank it. It dulled thirst, kept disease at bay, and filled the space where clean water could not. If fruit was plentiful, cider might be made. Wine and mead were for nobles and priests, not for those who bent their backs in the fields. Meals were simple, a ladle of pottage, a rough wedge of bread, perhaps a sip of ale. On feast days, things changed. A goose roasted, a pie spiced if someone had traded well. Music humming by firelight, but most days were plain. You ate quietly, scraped the bowl, and hoped there would be enough for tomorrow. Survival was the flavor. Repetition was the recipe. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe, peasants already lived side by side with sickness. Illness was not an event. It was the background hum of life. Fevers, infections, swollen limbs, deep coughs, any of these could turn fatal. A small cut, a sip of dirty water, a flea bite could end a life as surely as famine or war. There were no hospitals. At best, a village might have a wise woman who knew herbs, or a midwife who could ease childbirth. Sometimes a wandering monk offered prayers and a little knowledge. But most of the time, you stayed at home, sweating through fevers and hoping to wake again. Germs were unknown. Bad air was blamed instead. People stuffed herbs in their clothes, carried flowers, or pressed vinegar-soaked rags to their faces, believing foul smells carried death. Others said illness was punishment from God, or the work of curses and jealous eyes. Remedies were as strange as the fears, bleeding with leeches, smearing poultices of mud or bread, tying live chickens to swollen skin. Sometimes it soothed. More often it didn't. When the plague arrived in the 14th century, it was unlike anything before. The sickness came fast, a swelling in the groin or neck, a sudden fever, blood that blackened. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Villages emptied. Monks and priests, who once brought comfort, fell sick themselves. Funerals were abandoned, and mass graves swallowed whole families. Some peasants fled, others prayed louder, whipping their backs to beg forgiveness. A few turned violent, blaming strangers or sinners. Most simply endured, as they always had. And yet, even in the shadow of plague, life stumbled forward. Children learned which herbs might help, how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever. Families whispered prayers at night and told stories of survivors who lived through winter fevers, on garlic water and stubbornness. Disease was never gone, but neither was the will to continue. To survive was resistance, a quiet defiance against a world that seemed determined to end you. A peasant's home was not built to last. It was built to survive another season. Think of it less as a house and more as a fragile agreement between people and the land. Mud, straw, wood, and whatever scraps nature allowed, patched, repaired, and rebuilt over and over again. The walls bulged, the roof sagged, the floor shifted with each frost. Yet it stood, and that was enough. The walls were made of wattle and daub, sticks woven together, then plastered with a heavy mix of clay, straw, even manure. It cracked in the sun, crumbled in the rain, and had to be patched again before winter. The roof was thatched, golden when new, gray and leaky once the rains had their way. Buckets were placed beneath the worst drips. Floors were bare earth, hard in summer, soft in rain, frozen in winter. Rushes or straw were scattered to soften the mud. But soon, they rotted into dust and had to be replaced. Windows were rare, little more than holes covered with shutters. Glass was a luxury you'd never see. The cold came through. The smoke from the hearth stayed in. And animals often wandered inside. Goats, chickens, even a cow on cold nights. Privacy didn't exist. Most families lived in one shared room, maybe with a loft added later. Parents, children, grandparents, a cousin, sometimes even a neighbor's orphan child, all slept, ate, argued, and worked in the same space. In the corner, a smoky fire gave light, heat, and the faint scent of stew that had boiled too many times. Strangers might see poverty, but you saw persistence. A roof still standing meant victory. A dry corner was treasure. You knew every creak, every draft, every place where the light slipped through the slats. It wasn't comfort in the way we think of it now, but it was home, and it held you as long as you held it together. A peasant's life was never entirely his own. Over every hut, every field, every harvest loomed the presence of a lord. The manor might be miles away, but its shadow stretched across your doorway. You could till the soil, reap the grain, and feed your children, but none of it was truly yours. The land belonged to the Lord, and by living on it, so did you. Rent came not in coins, which few ever saw, but in labor and goods. Days of your wheat belonged to the fields of the manor, your hands blistering on land that would never feed your family. At harvest, a portion of your crop was carted away to fill the Lord's granary. Chickens, eggs, a share of honey, a jug of ale, all part of the unending payment. Even firewood gathered from the forest might be claimed as his right. Refusing was not an option. The bailiff, the reeve, the soldiers reminded you where you stood. Then there were taxes beyond the Lord. The church demanded its tithe, a tenth of everything you managed to scrape from the earth. Even in famine, the priest expected his due, for God's share came before your own. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, all carried fees. A cow slaughtered without permission was another fine. To grind your grain at any mill but the Lord's was forbidden. His miller took a share. To dot it was a web of obligations, pulling at you from all sides. Yet rebellion was rare. Most peasants accepted it as the way of the world, as natural as rain or winter frost. To resist meant punishment, sometimes death. To endure meant survival. And so you bent your back, paid your dues, and prayed that the next season would be kinder. Freedom was a word that drifted through songs and stories, but rarely touched the soil beneath your feet for peasants. Faith was not separate from life. It was stitched into every breath, every sunrise, every season. The church bells marked the rhythm of your days more reliably than the sun itself. They called you to prayer, to confession, to weddings, to funerals, to moments of joy and despair alike. Religion was not an option. It was the framework that held your world together. The parish priest stood as both guide and gatekeeper. He baptized your children, blessed your marriage, and read the final prayers over your grave. He also collected the tithe, a tenth of everything you owned. Sometimes more when the church needed repairs or the bishop made demands. The Latin he spoke at Mass was foreign to your ears, but the chants, the candles, the incense, and the ringing of the bell carried a power deeper than words. The calendar itself was holy. Feast days punctuated the year, offering moments of relief from endless labor. On saints' days, work paused, and you joined neighbors in celebration, sometimes with music, sometimes with a little ale or a rare piece of meat. Lent brought fasting and reflection, reminding you of sin and salvation. Easter and Christmas brought joy, even if the food was simple and the songs old. Faith also explained the unexplainable. Storms, illness, a poor harvest, all could be seen as signs of God's will or his anger. Saints were invoked for protection, relics were touched for healing, prayers whispered for strength. The church was both comfort and burden. It demanded much, but it offered meaning. In a life of hunger, toil, and uncertainty, belief was one of the few things that gave shape to suffering. Childhood in a medieval village was brief, fragile, and often overshadowed by work. A child was not seen as a separate stage of life, but as a small pair of hands to help the household survive. As soon as you could walk, you were expected to carry, fetch, tend, and watch. By 7, you were already part of the laboring world. Though your tasks were lighter than those of adults, the youngest carried water from the well, gathered eggs, or chased geese from the garden. They collected firewood, watched younger siblings, or kept the cows from wandering. Play existed, but it was stitched between duties. Children carved little toys from wood, rolled hoops, or played tag in the mud. Bones left from meals became dice. A leather ball, if one was stitched together, was a treasured thing. Songs and rhymes were passed down not only as games but as ways of remembering prayers, proverbs, and warnings. Education in letters was rare. Only the children of wealthier peasants or those destined for church life might learn to read, usually Latin prayers taught by a priest. Most knowledge was practical, passed from parents to children: how to plow straight lines, when to sew, how to mend clothes, how to prepare food without waste. A child learned quickly, because mistakes meant hunger, or worse, by early teens. Children were no longer thought of as children. Boys joined men in the fields, swinging tools as best they could, blistering their palms until calluses formed. Girls took on the work of women, grinding grain, spinning wool, tending gardens, preparing meals, and often caring for younger siblings as if they were their own. Marriage came shockingly early by our standards. Girls might be wed by 14, sometimes younger, especially if dowries or alliances were at stake. Boys, too, could be married before they reached 20. Childhood ended not with choice, but with duty. But even in such a hard world, there were moments of laughter. A harvest feast meant children stealing extra bites of food, racing each other in the fields. Winter nights meant stories told by the fire, tales of saints and monsters that widened young eyes. The bond between siblings was deep, forged by shared hunger, chores, and secrets. And though life pressed them into labor, children still found space to dream of cities, of freedom, of adventures whispered by travelers who sometimes passed through. A medieval child's life was short, often dangerous, but never meaningless. Each step from toddler to worker, to bride or groom, was bound tightly to the survival of the family. In their laughter and in their toil, you could glimpse the stubborn will of a community to keep going, one generation at a time. Though most days blurred into labor and hunger, peasants still found time for joy. Celebration was rare, but when it came, it burned brightly against the gray of routine. A feast was not only about food, it was about release, community, and remembering that life could hold more than toil. The church calendar set the pace for these moments. Saints' days, Easter, Christmas. These were times when war paused, fields were left unattended, and people gathered. The village would swell with music, fiddles, pipes, and drums cobbled together from whatever materials were at hand. Songs filled the air, some praising God, others cheeky and playful. Dancing broke out in the open fields or in the muddy square, with men and women circling, stamping, and laughing despite the sore muscles that carried them through their daily work. Food transformed on feast days. What was usually thin stew became thicker, richer, sometimes even with meat. Chickens or a pig might be slaughtered, bread freshly baked, ale brewed stronger than usual. Neighbors shared what they could, and for one night, the gnawing ache of scarcity softened. Children darted underfoot, stealing scraps, their laughter louder than the music. For many, feast days were the only chance to taste sweetness. Honey dripped on bread, apples roasted by fire, or rare spices traded from far away. Games and contests added to the merriment. Men might wrestle in the grass, compete at archery, or try to climb grease poles for prizes. Women sang ballads or raced each other in playful dares. Children played at mock battles with sticks, or chased hoops until they collapsed in the mud. Giggling, these small competitions gave pride, bragging rights, and something to remember long after the feast ended. Leisure outside of holidays was simpler, but still cherished. Winter evenings meant storytelling, legends of saints, ghosts in the woods, or great heroes whose deeds felt larger than life. Around the hearth, neighbors traded riddles or sang to keep the darkness at bay. Even weaving, carving, and mending could carry an air of quiet pleasure when done in company. Some peasants found escape in drink, the weak ale serving as both refreshment and comfort, and on rare occasions, someone returned from market with stronger wine to be passed carefully around. These moments of celebration did not erase the hardships of peasant life, but they gave it texture. They reminded weary farmers that life was not only about endurance, but also about connection to each other, to tradition, and a fleeting joy. In a world of uncertainty, festivals were sparks of light, brief, precious, and unforgettable. The life of a medieval peasant was written in calluses and sweat. Work was not a part of life. It was life itself. From the first light of dawn until dusk pulled shadows across the fields, your body was bent to the rhythm of labor. Season after season, year after year, spring brought plowing. With simple wooden plows, sometimes tipped with iron, you carved furrows into stubborn soil. The work was slow, exhausting, and often required more hands than a family could spare. Oxen strained under yokes, but even then, the plow often stuck. You leaned your weight into it, mud sucking at your feet, while your back ached from the cold morning air. Seed followed, wheat, rye, oats, barley, each scattered with a silent prayer that rain would come at the right time, that no blight would creep across the green shoots. Summer meant endless tending. You weeded by hand, stooped for hours until your spine screamed. You repaired fences, guarded crops from animals, and cut hay for the long months ahead. Children joined, pulling weeds, carrying water, scaring birds from the fields with shouts and clattering sticks. The sun burned your skin, sweat stung your eyes, and still the work did not stop. Autumn was harvest, both the most hopeful and the most brutal season. Every able body took to the fields, sickles flashing, arms swinging until they were numb. The days were long, but the urgency was greater. Grain left uncut could rot in the rain or be stripped by the wind. You bound sheaves, hauled them to barns, threshed with heavy flails, separating grain from straw and clouds of dust that filled your lungs. Hands blistered, skin cracked, and sometimes people collapsed in the fields from sheer exhaustion. Yet this was the moment the entire year hinged on. A poor harvest meant hunger, even death. A good harvest bought only a fragile security, always threatened by taxes, tithes, and the cold bite of winter. Winter did not mean rest. Though the fields slept, you worked indoors or in the forests. You mended tools, spun wool, wove cloth, patched clothing that had worn thin. Men cut wood in the freezing air, dragging logs back on aching shoulders. Women spun by firelight, hands raw from fibers. Children twisted rope, fed animals, fetched water that froze before it reached the hearth. Rest was rare, and when it came, it was filled with fear of what the next year might bring. The body bore the cost. Backs bent permanently, knees swelled, teeth rotted, and wounds often festered without healing. Splinters, cuts, burns, each carried risk. A simple infected blister could take a life. Yet peasants worked on, because stopping meant starvation. Work was not a choice, not a calling, but a necessity that shaped every breath, every meal, every night's sleep. And yet, even in this relentless toil, there was rhythm, even beauty. The fields turned from brown to green to gold, the sound of scythes swinging in unison, the creak of carts, the call of neighbors working side by side. It built a kind of music, harsh but familiar. Labor bound the community together as much as it broke bodies apart. In sweat and struggle, peasants carved not only survival but continuity, keeping the village alive. One aching day at a time. If labor was the constant heartbeat of a peasant's life, hunger was the shadow that followed close behind. It never truly left. It only grew sharper in years when the rains failed, or when the skies gave too much, drowning seed before it could grow. A single bad harvest was misery. Two bad harvests in a row were disaster, and 3 could erase entire villages. Famine was not a sudden event. It crept in slowly, like winter fog. First, meals grew smaller. The stick grew thinner, stretched with water, weeds, and whatever scraps could be found. Bread was mixed with bark, acorns, or ground up husks, turning it bitter, hard, and barely edible. Then animals were slaughtered before their time. Chickens, goats, even plow oxen that families depended on for survival. Next, seed grain, meant for planting, was eaten. And when even that was gone, famine bared its teeth. Hunger hollowed faces and made bones sharp against skin. Children's bellies swelled while their limbs grew frail. Old people weakened and slipped away first, often willingly, eating less so the young could live. Disease traveled with famine. Empty stomachs and thin bodies could not fight infection. Dysentery, fever, and cough took those hunger had not yet claimed. Cemeteries filled as fields failed. Desperation drove people to desperate acts. Bark and nettles were boiled into foul soups. Roots dug from the forest floor became dinner. Horses, dogs, and even cats vanished into cooking pots. And whispered rumors, darker tales spread, of people stealing the bodies of the dead for meat, or even worse, of neighbors turning on neighbors. True or not, the fear itself was enough to stain memory for generations. The church bells still rang, but prayers often felt unanswered. Priests preached that famine was God's punishment, urging repentance. Others said it was witchcraft or the work of demons. But peasants knew the truth more intimately. The soil could betray you, the weather could betray you, and the lords and priests would still demand their share, even as your children starved. Tithes were taken, rents collected, while families watched their last stores vanish. Mercy was rare. Hunger did not care about faith or duty. It only consumed, and yet, even famine could not erase the will to survive. Families learned tricks: how to catch fish with bare hands, how to gather edible herbs, how to dry nettles and grind them into flour. Mothers chewed bark to soften it for their children. Communities huddled together, sharing scraps, whispering encouragement, trading stories of years when the famine-broken fields grew green again. Hope was thin, but it was hope nonetheless. The end of famine never came suddenly. Slowly, new shoots appeared in the fields. Slowly, pots filled again with beans, barley, or cabbages. Slowly, laughter returned, though quieter than before. The memory of hunger never left. It carved itself into the bones of those who survived. A warning passed to children and grandchildren that life was fragile, that survival was never guaranteed, and that each meal was both a blessing and a victory. For peasants, war was not banners, glory, or nightly tournaments. It was fire on the horizon, footsteps in the night, and fear that everything you had, your fields, your family, your very home, could vanish in hours. Battles might be fought far away, but the suffering they created always spilled down into the villages that had no defenses. But prayer not when lords quarreled. It was peasants who bled. Armies needed food, and they took it wherever they marched. Grain was seized, animals slaughtered, houses stripped bare. What could not be carried was burned, leaving blackened ruins where homes once stood. Soldiers rarely cared who owned the land. Friend or foe, commoners paid the price. Women hid children in the woods while men watched from hedgerows, powerless to stop the destruction. Raids came even without great wars. Bandits roamed forest paths, striking isolated farms. Neighboring lords sent men to steal cattle or punish peasants, who worked fields to close to disputed borders. Viking ships, Mongol horsemen, or nomadic raiders in other lands, each generation had its invaders. To peasants, it mattered little whether they came with crosses, crescent banners, or no flag at all. All meant terror, hunger, and grief. The fear shaped daily life. Families buried what little wealth they had in clay pots beneath the earth. Women ground grain in secret, hoping to keep a few loaves hidden. Children were taught to run at the first sign of hooves or smoke. Villages built no fortresses, only trust in trees and distance. Some dug ditches, others raised crude wooden palisades. But none could truly withstand trained soldiers. Worse still, lords demanded military service. A peasant might be called to fight with little more than a wooden spear or a rusted blade. Fewer trained, fewer survived. And while men marched, their fields lay untended, guaranteeing hunger even if they returned alive. War was a tax paid in blood, more cruel than coins or grain. The scars lingered. Burned villages took years to rebuild, if they ever did. Orphans wandered roads, begging. Women bore children of violence. Songs and stories whispered of horrors. Neighbors hanged in trees. Entire hamlets vanished. Bells torn from chapels and melted into weapons. Were left ghosts, not heroes. Yet somehow, peasants endured. They rebuilt huts from ashes, replanted fields, comforted each other in the silence after screams faded. Fear became familiar, like hunger or sickness, another shadow to live with. And in surviving, they wove resilience into the fabric of village life. For every ruin, there was a hearth lit again. For every field trampled, another was sown. Peasants had no choice but to endure, and in that endurance, they carried the world forward. If work filled a peasant's waking hours, then sleep was the only true relief the body knew. Though even rest was fragile and uncertain. Beds were rarely more than straw piled in a wooden frame or directly on the dirt floor, covered with old cloth, wool, or animal skins. Families often slept together in one space for warmth, parents with children, sometimes even with livestock kept indoors on cold nights. Privacy did not exist. Rest was communal. Survival bound all bodies close. Sleep itself followed the rhythm of nature. In summer, when days were long and work stretched late into the evening, peasants often took short naps instead of long nights of rest. In winter, when darkness ruled, they might spend more time in bed. Though cold and hunger made true rest uneasy, many practiced what today would be called segmented sleep, waking in the middle of the night to tend fires, check animals, or whisper prayers before returning to their straw pallets. Midnight was not for silence, but for quiet tasks and murmured talk. The body carried the marks of labor. Hands grew thick with calluses, backs bent early, knees wore down from endless toil in fields. Most adults suffered from aching joints, rotting teeth, and constant fatigue by the time they reached their 30s. Cuts and bruises were everyday companions, and even small wounds could fester into deadly infections. A peasant's skin was toughened by sun, wind, and soil, yet still vulnerable to fevers and plague. Their endurance was not strength born of choice, but of necessity. Food and rest shaped health in unequal measure. A well-fed peasant after a good harvest might recover from strain, but famine years left bodies wasted and brittle. Women bore children frequently, their bodies worn thin from pregnancy, childbirth, and labor combined. Many died young, their bones buried with little more than a prayer. Men too, broken by accidents or exhaustion, often did not live to see old age. Longevity was rare. Survival itself was an achievement. And yet, even within this harsh existence, there were moments of comfort. A fire on a winter night, with family huddled close, offered warmth and safety. A jug of ale eased pain, loosened joints, and gave laughter room to breathe. Festivals allowed bodies to dance, if only for a few hours, forgetting sores and scars. Songs sung together at dusk soothed weary minds as much as they did tired muscles. Rest was never guaranteed, but when it came, it was treasured, a fragile pause in a life of endurance. The medieval peasant's body was both burden and tool, worn down by hardship, but also astonishingly resilient. They bent, but did not always break, and in their broken sleep, in their aching limbs, in their laughter despite exhaustion, we see the quiet heroism of survival written into flesh. The peasants of the Forgotten Valley did not measure time by calendars or royal decrees. Their seasons were carved by the air itself, the smell of thawing soil, the slow lengthening of shadows, the call of geese overhead. To them, the world was not divided into years, but into tasks: planting, tending, reaping, mending. This was the cycle that ruled more strongly than any king. When snow loosened its grip and the earth softened, children ran barefoot into mud, laughing even as their mothers scolded. Men lifted their faces to the pale sun, muttering quiet prayers that this year's seed would not betray them. Women spread washing on bushes, their hands red from the cold stream, but their voices soft with the relief of longer light. Summer came with insects thick as smoke and with work that never ended. Fields swallowed bodies from dawn until dark, but evenings were filled with voices. Songs drifted across the valley, some wordless, some carrying tales older than the village itself. People told stories to chase away weariness, of hunters who tricked wolves, of maidens who wove rivers into threads, of stars that were once farmers who worked to well and were lifted to the sky. Autumn arrived with both bounty and warning. The fields glowed gold, but every sheaf coat was heavy with fear. Would the store last? Would the Lord's men demand more than could be spared? Still, the air was thick with roasting smells, and children darted between piles of grain like foxes. The valley hummed with both exhaustion and gratitude. Winter was silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the mutter of wind against the huts. It pressed the families close, making them share warmth, share stories, share silence. Nights stretched so long that some believed time itself slept. Yet it was in winter that imagination bloomed most brightly. People dreamed of summers past and summers not yet born. Through all this, the seasons did not simply pass. They spoke. The flutter of leaves, the rhythm of rain, the glitter of frost. Each was a language peasants understood better than books or sermons. The valley was their scripture, and the turning year was the only text they truly read. In the hush of night, when the valley fell into silence and even the owls grew tired, the peasants lived a second life, the life of dreams. To them, dreams were not idle flickers of the mind, but messages, warnings, or sometimes cruel tricks played by spirits. A dream of clear water meant fortune. A dream of falling teeth meant death. Children learned these meanings as naturally as they learned to walk. For no morning began without someone retelling what they had seen in their sleep. Old Marta, who had survived more winters than anyone remembered, was the keeper of these interpretations. Her back was bent like a question mark, and her eyes clouded with mist. But her voice carried certainty. If a man dreamed of fire, she told him to guard his house against jealousy. If a woman dreamed of wolves, Marta warned that betrayal walked close. Some said she was half witch, others said she was touched by saints. In truth, she was both comfort and fear, and no one dared to ignore her. Superstition wove itself through daily life like invisible thread. When a crow sat on a roof, someone would spit 3 times to drive death away. If a child's hiccups lasted too long, neighbors muttered that an envious eye had cursed the baby. People hung bundles of herbs over doors, nailed horseshoes above thresholds, tied little bags of salt to children's belts. Every shadow in the forest had meaning. Every crack in the wall whispered a warning. The forest itself was a boundary, not only of land, but of understanding. By day, peasants gathered firewood at its edges, their laughter cautious. By night, the same trees turned into a cathedral of darkness, filled with sighs and shifting shapes. Children were told never to wander far, for there were things older than men, things that disliked being disturbed. Some swore they had seen pale lights drifting between trunks, or heard the sound of hooves though no animal was near. Folk tales grew from these fears. Mothers told of a woman in white who lured the lonely into marshes, of a black dog with eyes like coals that prowled crossroads, of spirits that slipped into houses through cracks and drank warmth from sleeping children. To outsiders, these were nonsense. To the villagers, they were as real as frost. Fear was not entertainment, but survival. To believe meant to live longer. Yet alongside fear lived hope. People read omens in the smallest things. The flight of geese, the way smoke rose from a chimney, the pattern of rain on the ground. A double rainbow meant luck. A hare running across a path meant guests would come. The world was alive with messages, if only one had the patience to notice. For peasants, who owned so little, the unseen world was wealth. Dreams gave them guidance, signs gave them order, and even dread gave them a kind of strength. Children grew up under these layers of belief, absorbing them as naturally as they absorbed language. A boy who stumbled in the field was told the earth spirits had tripped him for neglecting his prayers. A girl who found a four-leaf clover was praised as chosen by fortune. Laughter, warnings, scoldings, all carried the same lesson. The world was full of meaning, and nothing happened by chance. The unseen world gave peasants dignity, even if floors owned their bodies, even if priests judged their souls. The dreams and signs belonged to them alone. In their whispers of fear and hope, the villagers held power that no tax collector or bishop could take away. It was a hidden kingdom, fragile yet unbreakable, carried in the silence of winter nights and the murmur of summer winds. No one in the valley lived alone. A single hut could not stand without hands to patch its roof, nor could a single family survive a harsh winter without neighbors to share salt, fire, or tools. Life here was a fabric woven of bonds, some tight and warm, some frayed with envy or anger. But all essential. Love among peasants was rarely the tale of songs. There were no balconies, no roses offered in secrecy, no bars to immortalize whispered vows. Love was forged in fields, in shared buckets of water, in hands blistered from the same labor. A boy noticed a girl not when she wore fine clothes, for none had them, but when she sang while threshing, or when she carried more firewood than her size suggested. A girl noticed a boy not when he boasted, but when he rose before dawn to help his sick mother and still joined others in the fields. Admiration grew from endurance, respect from labor, and love. Love was simply the courage to choose one another in a world that gave no guarantees. Marriages were not always born of affection. Families often arranged them to secure survival. A daughter to a household with good oxen, a son to a family with wider land. Dowries were modest, sometimes no more than a goat, a patch of cloth, or a chest of seeds. Yet even in such bargains, tenderness could grow. The people bent over the same hearth might learn to laugh at the same mistakes, to endure the same losses, to share the same small joys. Love was not lightning. It was the slow warmth of embers, coaxed alive night after night. Jealousy, however, lived as close as love. The village was small, and eyes watched everything. A glance too long, a laugh too easy, a gift of bread offered to the wrong hands. These sparked whispers. Women muttered by wells, men exchanged looks in fields. Some feuds lasted years, fueled by suspicion of infidelity or envy of a neighbor's slightly fuller harvest. There were no courts to settle such matters. Grudges simmered in silence or erupted in sudden shouts that startled children and amused the old. Friendship carried equal weight. Boys who grew together in play often grew into men who trusted each other in fields, trading labor without coin. Women shared secrets and remedies, nursed each other's children, and mourned together at graves. A loaf of bread passed quietly in hunger, a cloak thrown over a shivering neighbor, a whispered prayer at someone else's sick. These acts were the true wealth of the valley. Conflict, too, was inevitable. Land was scarce, tools were fragile, animals were precious. A cow straying into another's field, a broken fence left unrepaired, a debt of grain unpaid. Such sparks often flared into quarrels. Fists flew at times, though rarely with lasting hatred. More often, disputes were mended with gestures. A loaf of bread left at the doorstep, a joint effort at harvest, a promise sworn before the priest. Survival demanded reconciliation. Bitterness, if left untended, could doom an entire household. Children absorbed these lessons early. They saw how neighbors argued and forgave, how marriages strained and healed, how friendship could be the difference between hunger and survival. They learned that love was not romance, but persistence. That loyalty was not spoken, but shown in work. That hatred was a luxury peasants could not afford for long. Death, too, wove its threads through these bonds. A funeral was not only a farewell, but a gathering of every tie in the village. The dead lay in the churchyard, but the living carried grief together. Women keen, men dug. Children whispered in awe. Death reminded them that none of their quarrels, none of their jealousies, None of their fleeting passions outlasted the earth itself. And yet, because of that, the ties of the living felt all the more urgent. In this village, love and anger, loyalty and betrayal, laughter and silence all coexisted, tangled and inseparable. The valley itself seemed to hold these bonds, echoing them in the turning of the seasons. For though peasants owned little, they owned each other, and in that fragile possession lay their only certainty. A village was not built of mud and straw alone. It was built of generations, of the invisible hands that stretched from the past into the present. Every hut, every field, every path between houses bore the weight of those who had walked before. And in the valley, time did not move in a straight line, but in a circle. Birth, labor, death. Birth again. Birth was the most fragile beginning. Women gave life not in quiet chambers, but in the same smoky huts where cooking and weaving and arguing filled the air. A midwife, usually the oldest woman who still had strength in her hands, guided the mother through pain, whispering prayers and charms. Herbs were burned, water was sprinkled, saints were invoked. Sometimes the cries of a child rose strong, and relief filled the hut. Other times silence followed, and grief pressed against the walls. There were no doctors, no medicines, only courage, tradition, and the stubborn will to keep trying. A newborn was not fully trusted by the living until baptism. Before that, it was said, the child hovered between worlds, vulnerable to spirits or the jealousy of neighbors. Baptism sealed the child into the community, a drop of water, a whispered Latin phrase none understood, a candle's flicker. From then on, the child was both a soul and a worker in waiting. Childhood was not innocence, but apprenticeship. Toddlers learned balance while carrying buckets almost too heavy for their arms. By 5, they chased chickens or gathered berries. By 7, they were expected to guard goats, weed gardens, or fetch wood. Games existed, but they were woven into tasks. A hoop rolled across the muddy square might be chased for joy, but often the same hoop carried kindling. Songs sung at dusk taught both rhythm and memory, embedding prayers and proverbs into playful rhymes. Children were both treasured and expendable. Families loved fiercely, but they also knew how thin the thread of life could be. A fever, a fall, a bad harvest, all could snatch a child without warning. Some families buried more children than they raised. Tiny graves lined the churchyard, marked by wooden crosses that rotted away long before memory did. Yet each surviving child carried not only hope but the weight of the dead siblings, who did not live long enough to labor. Adolescence came swiftly, often unnoticed until a child's body bent under the same tools as adults. Boys joined the rhythm of the fields, their hands blistering, their backs aching an echo of their fathers. Girls learned the weight of spinning wheels, grinding stones, and, soon enough, infants on their hips. Play ended not with age but with necessity. At 12 or 14, they were already considered ready for marriage, ready to carry the village forward. The transition was less a celebration than a surrender, a passing from one form of toil to another. Marriage marked not only a union of two people, but of two families. The wedding was one of the few moments of brightness when neighbors gathered. Bread and ale were shared, songs rose loud enough to carry into the woods. There was laughter, dancing, even stolen kisses. But beneath the joy lay calculation. Whose field gained new hands? Whose herd grew larger? Whose lineage might now have stronger footing? The church blessed it, but the earth measured it in labor. Parenthood was both burden and pride. Each child meant another mouth to feed, but also another back for the fields. Mothers bore child after child, their bodies worn thin by labor and birth alike. Fathers carried the double weight of providing for both living and unborn. Pride came not from luxury but from endurance. A child who survived to work beside you was wealth greater than coins. Old age was rare but sacred. Those who lived long enough to see grandchildren were living libraries. Their bodies bent, their teeth gone, their vision dim, yet their words carried weight. Around the fire, they rattled the same stories until children could recite them word for word. They remembered famines, raids, years of good harvest. Their knowledge was not written, but spoken, stitched into memory through repetition. To ignore an elder was unthinkable. Their very survival was proof of wisdom. But age was also burden. Old bones slowed the work. Shaky hands spilled as much grain as they ground. Sometimes elders were left in the corner, muttering prayers while the young labored. Yet even then, they served. They watched children. They blessed seeds. They whispered charms against illness. When they finally died, the village mourned not only a person, but a storehouse of memory. Death closed the circle. Funerals were simple. A wooden box if it could be spared, otherwise just a shroud. Bells tolled, prayers were muttered, and the body lowered in the soil that had already taken so many. Death was not an intruder. It was a neighbor, a familiar presence, always near. Children grew up watching burials, knowing their turn would come as surely as the seasons. Yet grief was real, sharp, and heavy. Women wailed, men dug, children stared. Each death reminded the village how fragile their bonds were, and how vital it was to cling to the living. And so, generation after generation, the circle turned. A cry of birth replaced a cry of mourning. A child who once carried water became a mother giving birth. An old man who had once swung a sickle became a story on someone's lips. The valley held all of it, joy, grief, endurance, and its silent hills. And though no book recorded their names, the peasants themselves were their own memory, their own history, their own fragile eternity. There were things that did not bend to the slow cruelty of seasons or the cold calculation of lords. They live in the small bright corners of life, the warm weight of a loaf into hands, the crack of a twig in a child's game, the song that rose when an old story returned to the tongue. These things, skills, songs, small mercies kept the valley whole in ways that neither law nor fear could touch. Craft lived in the hands. People remembered how to make what the world demanded of them. To men, fashion, fix. A woman who could spin a fine thread was as respected as a man who could bend iron. A good cobbler was wealth in wood and leather. For shoes that lasted through a hard winter were as important as an extra sack of grain. Trades were not grand in name, but they carried authority. The tanner knew the smell of hides and the secrets to soften them. The potter coaxed clay into vessels that survived fire and cold. Skills passed with touch. A child's fingers learned the right tug of twine by sitting on a knee and watching until their hands remembered. On certain days, the valley changed shape. Markets arrived like weather, not often, but with enough frequency to be a weather of its own. A peddler with a cart creaking under bolts and trinkets would appear at dawn, calling the names of things most villagers had never seen. He brought glass beads that caught sunlight and made women gasp, a scrap of bright cloth from a distant town, a small silver button so polished it looked like a star. Salt arrived sometimes in a wooden barrel, traded carefully for eggs or grain. Its arrival changed recipes and saved meat for months. For a day, the village unrolled into a larger world. People traded not only goods, but news. A rumor of a new bridge over the river. A rumor of a fair at a city market. A rumor of a strange man with a map who could read names of places like spells. Songs were the valley's public writing. Without books, people commemorated things by melody. A song might carry the name of a woman who had died in winter, or the legend of a fox that tricked an unjust taxman. It might hold the rhythm of a plowing day so that the field itself remembered how to bend. Children learned the verses with their chores. If you wanted to remember the order of tasks or the months when certain herbs flower, you sang. The simplest tune could be a map in sound, the line of a melody standing in for a footpath, all the way to the wrong tree and back. Songs smoothed memory. They held grief in their bends and joy in their refrains. It was common to hear an elderly voice start a line and to have half the children in the square pick it up as if they were stitching the tune together like cloth. The fire at night was a small court. People sat close, the smoke marking faces with a soft gray, and they summoned stories as if they were lamps to keep the dark sensible. The old told tales of lovers and rogues, of summers when blackberries grew so fat they could be eaten, until your fingers stained purple for days. They told of children who had walked away to find gold and returned broke but wiser. The young pressed forward for secrets, the one who had escaped a cruel master, the one who had seen a town where houses were taller than trees. Laughter broke the quiet. Sometimes a story turned into a song, and someone would start clapping a rhythm that echoed into the night. But alongside these small festivals lived the yearning for more. The valley bred a particular kind of hunger, not only for bread, but for horizon. A young man named Joran, who had tended his father's oxen since childhood, felt this hunger like a stone in his chest. He listened when travelers spoke of distant places where coins chimed like rain, and where the sea crashed on rocks as loud as thunder. In the market, he found a foreign coin thin and coppery that he kept hidden under his straw. At night, he drew maps in the dust, following river lines with a stick, imagining the edges of the world. For many, this longing was a private ember, kept small so the family would not worry. For some, it became a decision: leave at dawn with a pack and a prayer, or stay and make a life around the old hearth. Leaving was a cleft in the whole. Those who left learned different languages, some barbarous, some city slick and hard, and brought back tales that bent the mind. A woman who had gone to a coastal town to serve in a baker's will return, with the taste of salt in her lips and a new way to braid dough. Another who had gone with a band of threshers might come back with a scar, but with songs that spoke of new customs, dances without a priest to lead them. Most who left did not return at all. Sometimes news arrived late, and the village mourned when a body was washed up in a stranger's field. The memory of the gone was a double thing: a pride at their courage and a heavy silence in kitchens, where their chairs sat empty. Rumors were the currency of distance. A single traveler's tale could warp a season. They have built a stone road to the next town, a man would say, and suddenly the world seemed nearer. They have a foundry that can make axes like no other, another claimed. And men in the valley began to dream of stronger plows. Sometimes rumors were lies spawned by those who wanted to gain by stirring restlessness. A merchant wanting a better price for cloth, or a lord hoping to draw men into service. But many rumors were merely hope dressed up as news. There was craft and leisure too. On long winter evenings, people did not sit idle. They carved, braided, and repaired, turning spare hours into things that lasted. Mothers wove patterns on small looms, simple crosses and waves that meant safety and river, while their daughters sewed coats trimmed with favors meant to catch luck. Men polished old tools, not only for use, but as an act of respect. A well-kept scythe was a promise that the fields would be honored again. Some made toys: wooden horses with painted eyes, rag dolls with stitched smiles, whistles made from reed. These objects held more than play. They were small beacons of continuity, things handed down with names and the weight of stories. Evenings could be a time of bargains, not only for goods, but for futures. A mother might sit beside a young man and listen as he promised to work on her land, in exchange for her daughter's hand. Promises were measured in days of labor, in the size of a dowry, and whether a man would leave his trade behind. These arrangements were pragmatic, but not without tenderness. Both sides weighed risks and rewards. Both sides also hoped for an affection that would grow after vows were spoken. The way a sapling grows into a useful tree when watered with patience. There were quiet rebellions invisible to a lord's account books. A woman might teach herself to read the letters on a merchant's note, tracing the strokes with her finger in secret. A boy might hide a small wooden flute and play tunes that were forbidden at certain holy days, because they were tabadi. Baked into everyday life were acts of small autonomy, decisions made not in open revolt, but in the private economy of dignity. A neighbor who mended your roof out of feeling rather than debt bought you a kind of pardon that coins could not buy. Greed and generosity lived side by side. In a hungry year, the richest peasant might keep his bread and chain his gate. In the next, he might smear grease on his hearth and invite 10 neighbors in to share. Charity was not given only out of piety. Sometimes it was an investment in mutual survival. Families lent tools when storms came, shared beds in flooded cottages, and traded favors like old maps. These exchanges were the village's ledger kept on paper but deeply recorded in faces, and in how doors opened when someone knocked, and when the end of a life came. People returned to a certain humility. The final days were often simple. Friends brought soups. A priest might not always come, but a neighbor's hand was there. Children sat and watched, learning the rites of ending. People remembered by rituals without formality, leaving the deceased's favorite cup on the table, tying a thread to the door, placing a small sprig of herb on the chest. The body, once carried out, left a silence heavy enough to be heard. But in those silences, memory hummed. Who had loved? Who had worked? How hands had shaped meaning. In time, the garden grew back. The roof was patched. The fields were tilled again. Not all stories had neat endings, but the valley had the habit of making endings fold into beginnings. Finally, the valley taught an economy of hope, not the great hope that pretends the world will be easy, but a steady, tender hope that counted small things. One more seed saved in a jar, one more song taught to a child, one more night by the fire. Hope was measured in acts, mending a torn sleeve, hiding an extra potato, teaching a child a useful verse. It was in these acts that the future was carved. When the last embers died and the smoke thinned into the sky, people would map their days in the light left behind. They were not people of renown. They did not change laws or redraw borders. Yet in the slow accumulation of small kindnesses and stubborn workmanship, they made a world that could be lived in. The valley, quiet and stubborn, kept its music. The smallest voices, children, the elderly. The hands that knew every seam and seamstress kept playing it. In the end, what endured was simple, the work done for one another. The songs that named their losses and joys. The stories that would travel like seeds to the next winter and the next spring. The valley did not only grow grain, goats, and children. It also grew stories. They sprouted in silence, rooted in fear, and spread like vines from one generation to the next. In a place where few could read and none could write their own names. The imagination was the village's library, and in winter evenings, when smoke curled low and the wind pressed against the shutters, myths were taken out and rattled like tools polished for use. Every child in the valley knew the tale of the Ashen Bride. She was said to be a young woman promised in marriage to a cruel man. On the eve of her wedding, she fled into the forest and never returned. Some said wolves devoured her. Others said she became a spirit of the woods. On foggy nights, people swore they saw her drifting near the river, her face hidden beneath a veil of ash. To meet her eyes meant early death. But to leave bread at the water's edge might win her blessing for a marriage. There was also the black dog of the crossroads. No one had ever seen him by daylight, but at night travelers spoke of a shadow with eyes that glowed like embers. He prowled where paths crossed, waiting for the lost or the desperate. Children were warned never to whistle at night, for it was said the dog followed the sound. And once he followed, he never turned back. Some claimed he guarded treasure buried beneath the old oak. Others whispered he was the soul of a knight cursed for his cruelty. Either way, no villager passed a crossroads without making the sign of the cross and muttering a prayer. The forest itself was alive with tales. In its shadows lived the moth's mother, a spirit older than men. She was said to appear as a bent woman draped in green, her hair tangled with ferns, her breath smelling of earth after rain. Those who treated the forest with respect, taking only fallen branches, never cutting the youngest trees, might hear her humming, a tune that promised safety. But those who broke her rules vanished. Axes left in the woods overnight were found rusted. Hunters who mocked her whispers were found days later, their faces frozen in terror. Stars were no less full of meaning. Children were told that each bright point above was once a peasant, who had worked harder than death itself could claim. To rise into the sky, one must endure beyond hunger, beyond plague, beyond war, until the heavens themselves grew jealous. The Milky Way was believed to be spilled grain from the apron of a careless goddess, who, in her sorrow, left it shining forever. Men swore that if a star fell across the sky, it was a warning a lord would die, or a famine would come. Women whispered that a falling star meant a child would soon be born. Dreams were stitched into these myths. If a man dreamed of standing on a mountain, it was said he had glimpsed the edge of heaven. If a woman dreamed of walking barefoot through snow without freezing, it meant she carried the blessing of unseen hands. A dream of fire was feared. A dream of water was welcome. And some dreams were not spoken aloud, for fear that naming them would give them power. Children loved the frightening tales best. They shivered when told of the Candle Man, a figure said to wander the village on moonless nights carrying a single flame. If you followed him, the flame would lead you into the marsh, where no path returned. To stay safe, children were told to keep their faces turned away and to hold tight to their mother's skirts. Few adults admitted they feared the Candle Man, but on dark nights even the boldest men walked quickly past the marsh. Stories were not just diversions. They were laws dressed in imagination. The tale of the Ashen Bride taught daughters caution in marriage. The Black Dog reminded men not to wander at night. The Moss Mother instructed villagers to take only what they needed from the woods. In a world without written commandments, these myths were survival guides, sharper than any sword. And yet, myths also carried hope. They promised that peasants mattered, that their lives, so often overlooked, were noticed by spirits, by stars, by gods older than the church. They said that a loaf of bread offered at the river could win a blessing, that a whispered prayer beneath the oak might be heard. In a life of hunger and toil, myths were evidence that the unseen world cared. That suffering was not endured in silence. Elders guarded these stories like treasure. Around the fire, their voices carried rhythm as steady as a drum. Children leaned close, eyes wide, while embers painted their cheeks red. Every pause, every whisper, every gesture of the hand made the stories breathe. When the tale ended, silence hung heavy. The kind of silence that made the creak of the hut and the howl of the wind seem like voices of the myth itself. Generations layered the stories until they seemed older than the hills. And maybe they were. For myths, like seeds, sprouted not only in minds but in places. The crooked elm really did look like a woman's arm. The marsh really did glimmer strangely at night. To tell a story was to give shape to fear. And to give shape to fear was to hold it in your hand rather than let it roam free. And so, the valley lived not only on bread and stew, but on myths. They were the hidden harvest, grown in every season, passed from tongue to tongue like fire passed from stick to stick. And though no monk wrote them in his book, though no noble sang them in his hall, they endured. For as long as smoke curled above the huts, as long as children pressed their faces against their mothers for warmth, the myths remain, shadows given words, words given memory, memory given to the next night's fire. The valley had always been wary of footsteps that did not belong. Strangers were rare enough to be remembered for years. Their names turned into fragments of gossip. Their gestures were played like omens. Most who came passed quickly, merchants with carts or monks with begging bowls. But one autumn evening, when the air smelled of damp leaves and smoke, a man appeared on the path that led between the forest and the fields. He walked alone, carrying no cart, no banner, no companions, only a staff, a small pack, and a cloak frayed at the hem. By nightfall, the stranger had reached the cluster of huts. The village gathered as it always did when something unusual happened, not in welcome, but in wary silence, each person peering from behind doorways or fences. Tom, the old man who was called wise simply because he had outlived most others, stepped forward. "Your feet have carried you far," Tom said. "But far feet do not always bring good news." The man bowed slightly, his cloak brushing the dirt. "My name is Alaric," he said, his voice rough like unsharpened iron. "I come with no sword, no soldiers, no debts, only stories and a warning." His words stirred unease. Warnings were heavier than swords in these parts, for they often came true. That night, Alaric was given a place by the hearth in Marta's hut for the old woman, bent and sharp-eyed. said it was better to keep strangers close where one could watch them than to let them wander in darkness. He ate little, only bread and a sip of ale, but he spoke much. He told of roads broken by war, of towns emptied by plague, of fields left to weeds because no hands remained to work them. His stories spread like fire across the room, casting shadows deeper than the smoke. The children listened wide-eyed, half afraid and half enchanted. The adults' exchange looks heavy with dread. If such ruin walked the land beyond the valley, how long before it reached their own doors? Only Marta watched with a strange calm, her wrinkled hand moving slowly over the bundle of herbs at her side, as if measuring the truth of his tale against the whispers of old spirits. When silence fell at last, Alaric looked into the flames. "The world beyond your hills is breaking," he said. "Lords fight each other, priests die faster than they can be replaced, and the plague feeds on all without mercy. I cannot tell you when it will reach this place, but I know this, it will come, and when it does, the valley must choose cling to the old ways or walk a darker path to survive." His words left the villagers colder than the autumn wind. To hear the death and ruin move closer was one thing. To be told they would have to choose between faith and survival was another. Tom muttered a prayer. The children huddled close, and Marta only nodded, as though she had been expecting such a warning all along. That night, as Alaric lay on straw in the corner of the hut, the village slept uneasily. Dreams grew heavy, filled with black dogs, veiled brides, and the sound of unseen wings beating above the roofs. And in the morning, though the sun rose clear and cold, the valley no longer felt quite the same. The next morning, the village gathered again, drawn not by custom, but by unease. Alaric stood near the old elm at the center of the square, his cloak damp with dew, his staff pressed into the ground as though it rooted him there. The air was sharp, filled with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke, and silence hung as heavily as fog. "I spoke of a choice," Alaric began, his voice carrying even to the farthest hut. "You believe your valley hidden, safe from lords and wars. But the plague is not a soldier. It does not knock at gates or demand tithes. It slips through cracks. It rides on breath. It waits in silence. And when it comes, prayers will not be enough." The villagers shifted uneasily. Some crossed themselves. Others looked to Tom, as if his ears alone might shield them. Tom's goat bleated, breaking the silence, and for a moment the people almost laughed. But Alaric's eyes were steady, and his words dug deeper than any jest. "There are two ways," he continued. "The first is to cling to faith, to stand as you always have, trusting in God and in the turning of seasons. Perhaps some of you will endure. Perhaps your children will live, but many will not. The second way," he paused, and his voice dropped low. "The second way asks for courage greater than prayer. It asks for sacrifice." Marta's eyes narrowed, and she spoke before anyone else dared. "What kind of sacrifice?" Alaric turned his gaze to her, as if recognizing in her a mind older than superstition. "There are herbs and charms, yes, but they are not enough. What wards off death is not only what you carry in your hands, but what you carry in your heart. There are right-souled ones, older than churches, older than kings. They demand offerings, not only bread, not only blood of beasts, but sometimes more." A murmur rippled through the villagers like wind through dry grass. Some gasped, others frowned. A few clutched children closer. Marta's wrinkled hand stilled on her bundle of herbs, and Tom stepped forward, his voice trembling with both age and anger. "We are no pagans," he said. "We bow to Christ, not to shadows in the woods. Your words smell of witchcraft." Alaric did not flinch. "Call it what you will. Witchcraft, pagan memory, forgotten covenant, it is all the same. When the plague comes, it will not care whose God you call upon. You must decide if survival is worth more than obedience." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lena, the miller's daughter, whispered what many thought but dared not say. "And if we choose this darker way, what becomes of us?" Alaric's gaze softened, though his voice did not. "You live, and your children live. but you will never see the valley the same again. Once a path is walked, it cannot be undone. The villagers dispersed slowly, fear gnawing at their thoughts. Some muttered prayers louder than before, as if to drown Alaric's words. Others avoided his eyes, unwilling to admit their curiosity. Marta lingered, watching him with the stillness of awe, while Tom shook his head and spat into the dirt. That night, the village did not sleep well. Dreams again carried strange weight, fields turning black, rivers running red, a woman's voice calling from the forest. And though the fire in Marta's hut burned low, Alaric sat awake beside it, his staff across his knees, his eyes fixed on the doorway as if waiting for something more dangerous than dreams to arrive. In the days that followed, the valley became to villages sharing the same soil. Outwardly, life carried on as it always had. The fields were tended, the children fetched water, the goats bleated at dawn. But beneath the surface, a fracture widened. One half of the people clung tighter to the church, their prayers louder, their crosses worn smooth from constant touching. The other half, though quieter, stole glances at Alaric as he moved among them, as if waiting for him to whisper something that might save their lives when prayer failed. Tom, the elder, led the faithful. He gathered families each evening before the chapel's crude wooden cross, his voice hoarse as he urged them to repent, to resist temptation, to hold fast against the devil's tricks. The plague is God's test, he declared. Those who trust him will pass through fire. Those who stray will be consumed. The faithful nodded, though their eyes flickered with fear. They sang hymns, their voices trembling, and some claimed to feel warmth in the air, as if angels themselves shielded the valley. Yet in the shadows, whispers grew. Marta, who had once been merely the keeper of herbs and dreams, now became something more. People came to her hut at night, knocking softly, seeking not only poultices but answers. They spoke of nightmares that matched Alaric's warnings, rivers that stank of death, children coughing black phlegm, skies without stars. Marta listened, her wrinkled fingers tracing circles in the ashes of her hearth. And when she spoke, it was with the weight of 1,000 winters. Faith feeds the soul, she told them, but it does not always feed the body. If you would endure what comes, you must be ready to give something back to the earth, as our ancestors did before the first bells rang. She did not name the sacrifices, not yet, but her words were enough to plant seeds of dread and curiosity alike. Alaric did not press himself into either side. He walked between them, his staff tapping the mud like a metronome. To the faithful, he was a tempter. To the desperate, he was a guide. He answered few questions directly, choosing instead to tell stories of villages that clung to faith and withered, of villages that turned to older powers and lived but at a cost no hymn could erase. Children, too, felt the rift. Some joined the hymns, their small voices sharp with fear. Others followed Alaric at a distance, fascinated by the strange charms he carried. A bone carved with spirals, a stone drilled through with a natural hole, a pouch of herbs that smelled both sweet and bitter. Lena, the miller's daughter, was often among them, her curiosity the strong to smother. When her father caught her staring, he struck her cheek and warned her that no good came from watching shadows. But even the sting of the blow could not erase the pull she felt toward the stranger. The arguments began quietly, a loaf of bread shared in silence, a refusal to lend a tool, a muttered insult near the well. Then louder, shouts across the fields, curses traded when animals strayed. Neighbors who had once survived famine together now eyed one another with suspicion. Tom called these divisions the devil's wedge. Marta called them the beginning of truth. One evening, the conflict broke into open sight. A man named Osric, known for his temper and his oxen, accused his neighbor of stealing wood from his pile. The neighbor, desperate to keep his children warm, denied it. Words turned to fists, and blood stained the mud before others pulled them apart. Osric spat and shouted, "Better a thief than a pagan. Better my ox dead than my children cursed by your witch woman." His words struck harder than fists, and for the first time, the village could not laugh such anger away. That night, Alaric spoke again by the fire. His voice was low, but the flames caught his eyes, making them burn like coals. "You think you can choose neither path," he said. "You think you can linger in the middle, clinging to both faith and fear. But the plague will not let you. It will demand an answer. And when it comes, it will not wait for your prayers to ripen." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Mothers held children tighter. Men stared into the fire until their eyes watered. And even Tom, who never bent, looked at the ground as though searching for strength hidden in the soil far above. Clouds gathered, and the moon slipped behind them. The valley lay in shadow, the huts like broken teeth against the black earth. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, and though the villagers told themselves it was only an animal, each heart beat with a certainty that darker things waited just beyond the trees. The days shortened, autumn deepened, and the valley held its breath as though waiting for something unseen. The arguments of the villagers had not faded. They had grown sharper, like knives left too long without sharpening. Every glance carried suspicion. Every silence was heavy with words unsaid. Yet no one dared to leave. The forest pressed into tightly, and the roads beyond were haunted by more than wolves. Tom's followers clung harder than ever to the chapel. They repaired its sagging roof with mud and straw, lit candles even when tallow was scarce, and sang hymns until their voices cracked. Some fasted in the belief that self-denial might ward off the pestilence. Others carried crosses carved from oak, wearing them on rock cords around their necks. Tom himself seemed both stronger and frailer. His voice roared with faith, yet his body shook when no one was looking. He told them often, "Hold fast, children of Christ, for no shadow can outlast his light," and the people nodded, though the shadows in their dreams grew longer in contrast. Marta's hut became a second chapel of sorts. By night, the fearful came in ones and twos, bearing gifts of eggs, cheese, or strips of cloth. They sat by her hearth as she fed the fire herbs that hissed and sparked, filling the air with bitter smoke. She spoke of old ways, not openly, but in riddles, of how bread crumbled into earth could feed more than worms, of how the blood of beasts could draw lines that no sickness crossed, of how a whispered vow by moonlight could bind a family tighter than chains. Some left horrified, others curious, and a few with their minds already half made up. Alaric remained a shadow moving between the two worlds. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a danger. He wandered the fields during the day, speaking little, touching the soil as if listening for something beneath it. At night, he lingered by the fire, his eyes catching every flicker of flame, his voice carrying stories from distant lands where pestilence had devoured whole cities. "I have seen bones piled higher than men," he said once. "I have seen priests bury priests until none were left to say the prayers. And I have seen villages where only the dogs survived." His words silenced even the boldest, for they carried the weight of truth heavier than fear itself. One night, as frost whitened the thatch roofs and the stars shivered above, Lena crept to Marta's hut. She carried no gift, only questions that burned the hot to smother. Marta let her in, her eyes sharp despite the hour. The girl whispered, "Is it true? Must there be more than bread, more than beasts? Must it be people?" Marta studied her long, the firelight painting her wrinkles into deeper lines. "The earth takes what it needs," she said at last. "Sometimes it is enough to give grain, sometimes milk, sometimes the blood of a lamb. But there are years when the hunger is deeper." And then she broke off, tossing another bundle of herbs into the fire. Sparks leapt upward, and for a moment Lena thought she saw faces in the smoke, pale and pleading. She pressed her hands to her ears, but no sound came, only the crackle of burning leaves, terrified. Lena fled into the night, yet even as her breath misted in the cold air, she felt a strange pull like a thread tying her to what she had seen. She knew she should tell her father, tell Tom, tell anyone, but the words stuck in her throat, heavy as stones. Meanwhile, others began to act. Small things at first, a loaf buried in the fields, a black rooster slain, and its blood scattered at the boundary where forest met farmland. A few villagers claimed their dreams grew lighter afterward, that their coughs eased. Their children slept without fear. Word spread in whispers, and soon more began to try. Not everyone believed, but doubt itself was dangerous. Was it better to mock the offering and risk the plague, or to try and hope? Tom confronted Marta at last. It was at dawn, the mist still clinging to the valley floor. He stood before her hut with half the village at his back, a wooden cross in his hand. "You poison them with lies," he thundered. "You lead them to damnation. This valley will not bow to idols, not while I draw breath." Marta stepped out slowly, leaning on her stick, her eyes bright as embers. "And what if your breath is not enough? What if prayers do not fill bellies, nor stop the black swellings that will come? Will you dig every grave with your faith alone, Tom?" The people watched, torn between the two. Some crossed themselves, others stared at the ground, unable to choose. The mist swirled around their legs, hiding where one shadow ended and another began. For a heartbeat, it seemed the earth itself held its breath. Alaric appeared then, as if from nowhere, standing between them. His staff struck the ground once, sharp as thunder. "Enough," he said. "The plague does not wait for your quarrels. It is already nearer than you know." His words froze them more than the chill air, for in his eyes there was no threat, only certainty. That night, the dreams came again stronger, darker. Children woke screaming of faceless men standing at the foot of their beds. Women dreamed of rivers of ash. Men saw themselves digging graves that had no end. And when dawn came, a crow perched on the chapel roof, cawing until its voice broke. No one dared to chase it away. The valley had always known sickness. Children coughed through winters, fevers came with summer heat, and wounds turned foul if not tended. But what arrived now was different. It came quietly, like a shadow slipping beneath the door. The first was Osric's youngest son. He woke one morning with swollen glands beneath his neck, his face hot and pale at once. His mother thought it a fever, nothing more, and laid him on straw with damp cloths across his brow. But by evening his body shivered as though winter itself lived inside him. His breath grew shallow, his lips darkened. When his skin bloomed with blackened spots, the whispers began. Neighbors avoided the house, crossing themselves as they passed. Osric stood outside, his fist clenched, shouting that it was only a sickness, that his boy would rise again. But fear is louder than words. By nightfall, no one came near. The boy died before dawn. His cries faded in the silence, and the silence into weeping. The body was carried quickly to the edge of the woods, wrapped in rough cloth, laid in a shallow grave. No priest came, for Tom feared to stand close. He muttered prayers from a distance, his voice trembling in the mist. The earth swallowed the boy, but the fear remained above ground. 2 days later, another child fell ill. Then a woman, her armpit swollen, her eyes glazed. Within a week, 3 more had followed. The valley's rhythm faltered. Work slowed in the fields, for no one wanted to share tools or touch the same handles. The well stood lonely, the bucket rope avoided as though it carried death. The chapel bell rang for the dead until its sound felt less like comfort and more like warning. Tom's voice grew louder in those days. He preached that the plague was punishment, that repentance alone would shield them. He urged fasting, prayer, the burning of candles even as wax dwindled. Some clung to his words like a rope above a pit. They filled the chapel, their knees raw from kneeling, their lips cracked from endless hymns. Yet each morning another name was added to the whispers of the sick. Marta, meanwhile, whispered differently. Her hut filled with smoke thicker than ever, the air sharp with the sting of sage and wormwood. She tied bundles of herbs to door frames, hung small bags of salt around children's necks, painted strange marks with ash above the thresholds. It will slow the pestilence, she promised. It will turn its eyes elsewhere. Some believed, some doubted, but more and more followed her. And beneath her words, another truth stirred. The old sacrifices were drawing nearer. Alaric watched, silent but present, He spoke little, but his eyes carried a sorrow deeper than anger. Once, Lena dared to ask him, "Have you seen this before?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I have seen valleys emptied. I have seen mothers bury all their children. I have seen men dig their own graves before fever carried them away. And I have seen villages survive but not without cost." His words haunted her dreams, and she woke each morning with her heart racing, unable to forget. The arguments of the living turned harsher. Tom accused Marta openly of leading souls astray. Marta retorted that Tom's prayers filled graves faster than earth could cover. The people divided, not only in faith but in survival. Some huddled in the chapel, clinging to crucifixes. Others buried bread in the fields and whispered Marta's charms. Families that had once eaten from the same pot now avoided one another, as if friendship itself carried infection. Then came the night of fire. Osric, maddened by grief, set torches to Marta's hut. Flames rose against the dark sky, sparks showering like stars. People rushed to stop him, but fear made their hands slow. Marta stood before the blaze, her silhouette black against the fire. She did not cry out, did not move. Only when the flames licked her roof did Alaric step forward, his staff raised. With a single motion, he struck Osric's torch aside, sending it spinning into the mud. Full. Alaric thundered, his voice deeper than the fire's roar. "You think flames will kill the plague? You think burning wisdom will shield your children?" Osric collapsed to his knees, sobbing, while Marta's hut smoldered, half-charred, but still standing. The people watched in silence, their fear doubled fear of sickness, fear of wrath, fear of one another. And as dawn broke, another body was carried to the woods. The plague had found them, and it was only beginning. The plague did not march like an army. It crept like smoke. One house at the edge of the village fell silent, then another, then another. The coughs that once sounded ordinary now echoed like tolling bells. Men grew afraid to touch their wives. Mothers feared to cradle their own children. Neighbors no longer borrowed even a loaf of bread. The valley shrank into itself, every hut and island surrounded by suspicion and dread. By the second week, the count of the dead had reached 10. Graves lined the edge of the forest like dark teeth biting into the earth. Tom still led prayers, but his voice cracked more often now, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He spoke of Job, of faith and suffering, but few were gathered in the chapel. Some were too sick to rise from their beds. Others had turned away entirely, whispering that God had abandoned them or that he was punishing them too cruelly to bear. Marta's hut became crowded, though she accepted only a few at a time. She mixed stronger brews, fed fires with bundles of bitter herbs, and drew symbols on foreheads with ash. "These will help you endure," she promised, though even she did not say survive. Yet the people clung to her, desperate for anything that was not silence and death. And still, behind her words, another weight grew heavier, the unspoken knowledge that herbs alone could not turn back. What had begun? It was one night, beneath a moon swollen and red, that the first secret offering was made. A goat was taken, its bleeding muffled with cloth, its throat cut at the border of the fields. Its blood was poured into the soil, steaming in the cold night air. Those who gathered swore they heard the earth sigh, as though drinking. Marta stood with them, her face solemn, her hand steady as she scattered herbs into the crimson pool. "It is a beginning," she said softly, "but the earth hungers more." Word of the rite spread quickly, though none admitted to speaking. Tom heard whispers and denounced them from the chapel, his voice breaking with fury. "You trade your souls for lies. You will bring damnation on us all." But even as he thundered, his congregation dwindled. The sick no longer came, and the living feared to sit close together. His cross, once a symbol of unity, now stood like a lonely sentinel, unguarded, unheeded. Then came the night of the black dog. Lena was the first to see it, a creature larger than any hound. Its fur matted, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It prowled the edge of the fields, its paws leaving no prints in the frost. She called out, but it did not look her way. Instead, it raised its head and howled, a sound that froze the marrow of every villager who heard it. Some said it was death itself, walking on four legs. Others whispered it was the guardian of the old rites, summoned by blood spilled on the earth. Fear thickened until the air itself seemed poisoned. Families barred their doors, shuttered their windows, yet still the plague found them. Coughs rattled through the night, and the smell of sickness clung to the air. Men with shovels grew weary, their backs bent from digging graves that multiply like weeds. The children stopped playing, their laughter replaced by silence too heavy for their ears. Then came the first human sacrifice. None spoke of it openly, yet the story seeped through walls like smoke. A man, fevered and dying, begged not to be buried nameless and cold. His family, broken by grief, carried him to the edge of the fields where the goat's blood had once soaked the soil. There, beneath the red moon, he offered himself. They said Marta was there, her hand steady, her voice low as she chanted words older than any prayer in the chapel. They said Alaric turned his face away, unable or unwilling to stop what was done. The next morning, that family found their other children free of fever. Their hut, which had smelled of sickness, smelled only of smoke. Some took it as proof, others as horror. But either way, the whispers spread faster than the plague itself. By the end of the week, the valley was no longer whole. Half knelt in the chapel, their voices hoarse from prayer. Half gathered in the fields at night, their hands stained with blood and ash. Between them stood Alaric, silent, weary, watching the valley tear itself apart under a sky that grew darker each night. And far above, the crows circled in flocks so large that the sun itself seemed blotted out. The valley no longer breathed as one. Each hut was its own coffin, each family its own kingdom of fear. Smoke rose in thin columns from roofs, not with the smell of meals but of herbs, of burning rags, of desperation itself. The air carried a constant undertone of coughing and weeping, broken by the thud of shovels in the soil. It seemed the earth was hungrier than ever before, swallowing bodies faster than words could name them. By the third week, the number of graves had doubled. Men stopped carving crosses for each mound, for there was no time. Instead, they thrust simple sticks into the dirt, which soon leaned and rotted, leaving the dead nameless beneath. Even Tom's faithful began to waver. They filled the chapel, yes, but their hymns faltered, their eyes darting to every cough. Some whispered that perhaps Marta's way was not wholly evil, for at least her herbs smelled of action, while prayers smelled only of wax and smoke. Tom fought to hold them. He preached until his voice broke, raised his cross high until his arms shook. Stand fast, he roared. The Lord tests his people as he tested Israel in the desert. Do not falter, or you will be lost forever. But though his words thundered, his body grew thin, his eyes sunken, and in the shadows even his most loyal wondered how long his strength would last. Marta, meanwhile, had ceased to hide. Her hut no longer sufficed. She moved her gatherings to the fields themselves, beneath the cold sky and the circling crows. Fires were lit at the boundaries, and herbs burned in great piles, filling the valley with bitter smoke. The earth must be fed, she told them. It is the only way to turn the plague's gaze aside. No longer did she speak in riddles. Now, her words were plain, and her followers nodded, some trembling, some eager, all desperate. The first human sacrifice had been whispered. The second was witnessed. A woman, fever-ridden and half delirious, was carried by her own kin to the field. Her cries mingled with the wind, but they did not turn back. Marta's voice rose above them, chanting in the tongue of old, her staff tapping the ground in rhythm. When the knife flashed, some turned their faces, but others watched, believing their lives balanced on the edge of the blade. The next day, no one in her household fell ill. It was enough. Enough to convince those wavering. Enough to silence the doubts of many. From then, the sacrifices came more often. Always those already marked by the plague. Always with chance. Always beneath the moon. Alaric stood apart, but he did not stop it. He watched with eyes heavy as stone, and when asked, he only said, "The choice was always yours. I warned you." Yet his presence lent weight. To some, he was complicit. To others, he was witness, binding them to fate. Fear changed its shape. Once it was of sickness, now it was of neighbors. Who would give? Who would be given? Families whispered behind doors, deciding whom they might offer if the plague touched them. Old debts, old grudges, even old love began to twist into fuel for choice. And in the chapel, Tom thundered louder than ever, cursing the sacrifices as abominations, promising that fire from heaven would fall upon them. But fewer came to hear him. Some said his words rang hollow. Others said his God was too slow. Then came the disappearances. At first it was only the sick carried out at night, but soon, healthy ones were gone as well. A boy of 12, strong and unmarked, vanished from his bed. His mother tore her hair, screaming his name, but no answer came. People muttered, some saying the plague had taken him, others whispering the darker hands had. When his body was never found, fear grew teeth. No door felt strong enough, no lock firm enough. The black dog returned, prowling nearer now, its eyes catching firelight as it watched from the edge of the fields. Some swore it spoke in a voice like wind, that it named those who would not see dawn. Children hid their faces, and men gripped tools as weapons, though none dared approach it. Each howl it gave felt like a tolling bell, and each time, within a day, someone else fell ill. Alaric grew more silent, his face a mask carved from sorrow. Yet one evening, as Lena lingered near, he whispered to her, once, "I thought this valley might choose differently, but people are as rivers always flowing back to their oldest channels, no matter how you dam them." His words struck her deeper than the howls. She knew then that no matter what path they had chosen, the valley was no longer the same. And in the nights that followed, the veil seemed to tear thinner between the living and the dead. Shadows lingered too long in corners. Voices called from fields where no one stood. Dreams bled into waking, and waking into dread. The valley was no longer waiting for the plague. It was becoming part of it. By the time the first snow dusted the roofs, the valley was no longer hidden. Not from itself, not from the world beyond. The plague had carved itself into every face, every voice, every step. The people no longer spoke of before. There was only now and after. A word few dared to hope for. The sacrifices were no longer whispered of in corners. They were done in the open fields, beneath the moon and the watching crows. Fires blazed high, fed with wood that might have warmed homes. Men and women gathered, their eyes hollow, their breath white in the cold air. Marta led them, her voice unshaken, her staff planted firmly in the soil. "The earth is awake," she declared. "The earth hears, the earth answers, but it must be fed. No longer only the dying were given." A boy fevered, but not yet lost, was carried by his kin, lay before the flames. He cried for his mother, and she held his face, whispering, "Forgive me, forgive me." As others held her arms, the knife fell. His blood hissed on the frozen ground. The crows screamed as one, rising into the night like smoke. And when morning came, no one in his household coughed. The line had been crossed, and there was no return. Tom thundered louder than ever, his voice shaking the chapel walls. "Abominations, idolaters, you burn your children and call it salvation. The Lord will strike you down." He raised his cross until his arms trembled, tears streaking his face. Yet fewer stood with him. Some because they feared the plague more than God, others because their grief had broken them, and some because they had already bent their knees to Marta's fire. But there were still those who believed, and belief is a weapon as sharp as any blade. One night, as Marta's circle gathered, the faithful stormed the field. They carried torches, not for worship but for war. Tom at their head, his cross held high, his voice a roar. And this wickedness, or we will end it for you." Chaos followed. Cries split the air. Fists struck. Torches clashed against staffs. A woman fell into the fire, her screams tearing through the night before silence claimed her. The crows wheeled overhead, shrieking, their wings black against the moon. Alaric stood between them, his staff striking the ground again and again, his voice a thunder none had heard before. "Stop this," he bellowed. "Do you not see? You are feeding the plague with your hatred as much as with your blood." But they did not hear, or if they heard, they did not care. The fight ended only when exhaustion overcame fury. The faithful dragged Tom back to the chapel, his robe torn, his face bloodied. Marta's people gathered around her, their eyes wild, their hands still shaking. The field was littered with broken wood, spilled blood, and the stench of smoke. No victor, only ruin, and yet the plague did not pause. That very night, another child fell ill. The morning brought to more. The valley reeled, broken in spirit as well as body. No one trusted their neighbor. No one trusted their God. Some began to whisper that perhaps the plague was not a punishment at all, nor a hunger of the earth, but something else entirely. Something that had been called to the valley, not born within it. Something watching from the dark. Lena felt it most. Each night she woke with a sense of eyes upon her. Eyes not human, eyes not kind. She dreamed of the black dog standing in her doorway, its breath steaming, its voice whispering her name. She dreamed of Alaric weeping into the fire, his tears turning to sparks. She dreamed of Marta's face changing, her wrinkles twisting into roots, her eyes into coals. And each morning, she rose with her heart pounding, unsure whether she had woken at all. The valley was tearing itself apart, and above it, the sky grew darker, the sun dimmer, as if even the heavens turned their face away. The valley had always been a place where silence meant safety. For generations, the people had lived in the rhythm of seasons, rarely disturbed by anything but hunger, rain, or the distant thunder of lords' quarrels. But now silence had turned into something heavier. It was no longer rest. It was a pause before a blade fell. Tom's followers clung to the chapel with the desperation of drowning men. Every morning they gathered under the crooked wooden cross, their voices hoarse as they sang hymns into the gray sky. They brought their children, their goats, their fears, laying them all at the foot of the cross as if Christ himself might step down and shield them. Tom, though bent with age, roared with the strength of a man who believed his words could force the heavens to listen. He spoke of trials, of suffering as proof of God's favor, of the plague as a furnace in which only the pure would survive. Marta's hut, meanwhile, had grown into something darker. Smoke curled from her roof at night, green and bitter, filling the air with scents that were neither wholly pleasant nor wholly foul. People went to her quietly, when the moon was high or the fog lay heavy on the fields. They carried offerings, eggs, cheese, sometimes even drops of their own blood pricked from the fingertip. They whispered questions they dared not ask in daylight. Will my child live? Will the sickness find us? Will God forgive me if I choose this way? And Alaric, he walked between them. To the faithful, he was a devil, tempting them with stories of survival without grace. To the desperate, he was a lantern, showing paths they had long forgotten, but always feared. He never commanded, never demanded. He only told stories. But those stories took root deeper than any sermon. The village, once one body, had become two, and the seam between them began to tear. It started small, with whispers. A loaf of bread missing from a storeroom. A charm of herbs nailed above a doorway when the owner claimed to trust only in God. Neighbors watching each other not with kindness but with suspicion. Mothers warned their children not to play with the children of the other side. Old friends stopped sharing tools. Even the dogs seemed to bark differently, choosing sides without knowing why. Then came the sickness. It did not roar into the valley like a storm. It crept, soft as a thief. A child in the farthest hut coughed blood into her hands. Within 2 days she was dead. The family buried her quickly. But two more followed. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Tom declared it proof of sin, a punishment for those who had listened to Marta. Marta claimed it was the beginning, the whisper of the earth demanding its due. Alaric only shook his head, as if he had always known this moment would come. Arguments became shouts. Shouts became blows. Odric, the ox keeper, accused his neighbor of poisoning his well with herbs. The neighbor struck back, and in the mud between their huts blood was spilled. By nightfall the village had its first living wound, to families no longer speaking, to households glaring at each other across a path that had once bound them in friendship. The next morning, Tom gathered his faithful. He raised a wooden cross high, his hands trembling not from weakness but from fury. "We will not let shadows take us," he thundered. "Better to starve with Christ than feast with demons. Better to die clean than live cursed." His followers echoed his cries, some with tears in their eyes, others with rage in their throats. They marched through the village, chanting, splashing holy water on doorways they claimed were tainted. Marta's people did not resist openly. They watched in silence, their faces closed, their hands tightening around hidden charms. That night they gathered in her hut, where firelight danced against the walls. Marta's voice was low but steady. "Faith will not fill your lungs when sickness steals your breath. Faith will not keep your child from the grave. The earth is older than their prayers, and the earth will listen if you feed it." For the first time, she named it a sacrifice of blood. Not only of beasts, but of kin if need demanded. Some gasped, others wept, but none walked out. Fear held them in place as tightly as devotion held Tom's flock. The rift widened. One evening, as the sun bled behind the hills, Alaric stood by the old elm and spoke to anyone who would listen. "You think you can choose neither way, that you can hide in the middle while the plague passes over you. But the plague does not pass over. It does not respect walls, nor prayers, nor bargains. It will enter every hut. The only choice you have is how you will face it, on your knees, or with your hands stained red." His words fell like stones, and though no one answered, their silence was heavier than shouts. That night the valley did not sleep. Fires burned to long, prayers muttered to loud, charms buried to hastily. Children cried without reason. Wolves howled in the forest, and even the bravest men stayed indoors. And in the darkest hour, a new sound rose, the slow toll of the chapel bell. It rang not for prayer, but for death. Another child had fallen. The valley held its breath, knowing the plague had truly come, and that no sermon, no charm, no silence would hold it back now. The plague did not sweep across the valley like a storm of fire. It seeped slow and merciless, like water rising in the night. One by one, huts grew silent. Where once smoke curled from every roof, now some chimneys stood cold. Where once children chased each other in the mud, laughter was replaced with coughing that rattled like broken branches. Tom preached harder than ever. His voice cracked, but his eyes burned with feverish faith. "The Lord weighs us," he cried in the chapel square. "He sorts wheat from chaff, sheep from goats. If you fall, it is because you were faithless. If you survive, it is because you held true." He ordered processions through the village, men and women dragging bare feet through mud, singing psalms with bleeding lips. Some whipped their own backs until their shirts clung wet with blood. Children were forced to kneel until their legs shook, repeating prayers until they collapsed in exhaustion. Marta watched with contempt in her hut. She gathered her followers closer. She mixed herbs that hissed when cast on the fire. She drew marks with ash on the floor. "The plague is not a test," she told them. "It is hunger, hunger of the earth, hunger of spirits. It takes what it must. If you wish to live, you must feed it before it feeds on you." She spoke of sacrifices again. A goat, a black rooster, a lamb. Yes, but she hinted at more. When the hunger grows, when the earth cries louder, what will you give? Will you wait for it to take your child, or will you choose what to offer? Whispers turned into deeds. A farmer, desperate, slit his goat's throat at midnight and buried the carcass at the edge of the field. The next morning, he swore his wife's fever had broken. Others followed. Chickens vanished, their blood staining the earth near Marta's hut. Bread was buried in furrows. At night, smoke rose thicker, and the faithful crossed themselves more fiercely as they passed her door. But still the plague spread. The first to fall among Tom's flock was a woman named Elwyn, mother of 3. She had walked in every procession, whipped her back raw, prayed until her voice was gone. When the swelling came to her throat, Tom declared it a trial of Job. She died into days, her children coughing beside her. They'd have followed. Tom stood at their grave with shaking hands, his faith louder than his grief. The Lord calls his saints home. He shouted, though his eyes were wet, "Do not fear death, fear only sin." Yet more graves opened, and more smoke vanished from chimneys. Even Tom's most faithful began to doubt. Some drifted toward Marta, whispering that prayer was not enough. Others clung tighter, terrified that doubt itself was a sin worse than plague. The valley was no longer split in two. It was shattered into pieces, every family a battleground of belief and dread. And Alaric watched. He did not command, but his presence pressed on them like a storm on the horizon. Children followed him in secret, whispering questions. Men lingered near him, listening though they pretended not to. Women met his eyes and quickly looked away, as if afraid he could see what they hid. He told more stories, of towns that chose faith and burned with their priests inside, of villages that fed the earth with darker offerings and stood untouched by death. Lena, the miller's daughter, was drawn to him most of all. Her father forbade her, struck her for listening, but her heart burned hotter than her fear. She crept after Alaric when he walked the boundary of the forest. She heard him speak to the trees as though they answered, saw him place small stones in careful patterns on the ground. Once she dared ask, "Will you save us?" Alaric did not smile. "I cannot save you. I can only show you where the path divides. One road ends in prayer and silence. The other ends in blood and survival. But both end in change. You will never return to what you were." The girl trembled. "And if I choose nothing, then the plague will choose for you." Meanwhile, the dead multiplied. Graves filled so quickly that some bodies were laid without coffins, only wrapped in cloth and lowered into earth that stank of decay. Dogs prowled near the mounds, and children screamed when they saw bones jut from shallow soil. Fear turned to rage. Tom's followers accused Martas of inviting the plague with their witchcraft. Marta's people accused Tom of starving the earth by denying its hunger. A fight broke out at the well, and this time no one stopped it. A man's skull cracked against stone, and his blood ran into the bucket. Women screamed. Children scattered. By nightfall, the village was no longer one place. It was to camp staring at each other with weapons in hand. That night, the bell tolled again, not once, but 5 times. An entire family gone. The valley lay in darkness, firelight flickering like frightened eyes. Alaric stood at the old elm once more, his cloak heavy with dew. His voice carried through the night. "You have prayed. You have bled. You have buried. Still the plague comes. Tomorrow you must choose. Faith or blood, cross or earth. And when you choose, there will be no turning back." The people listened, though none spoke. But in the silence, each heart knew. The valley had reached the edge, and what came next would either damn them forever, or let them live the night before the choice. The valley did not sleep. Torches burned where no torches had burned before, set into the ground outside huts as though fire could guard against pestilence. Dogs barked without cause. Children whimpered even in their dreams. The air itself felt sick, heavy with smoke, rot, and dread. Tom prayed until his voice was nothing but a rasp. In the chapel, lit only by flickering candles, he pressed his forehead to the rough wood of the cross. "Lord, shield us. Lord, save us. Do not let them turn from you." He had begun to look like the very saints painted in faraway churches, hollow-cheeked, eyes burning with faith that teetered on madness. His followers gathered outside, murmuring psalms through tears. Marta, in her hut, prepared the earth. She scattered bones over the floor, poured wine into the soil until it drank deep, and whispered words that had not been spoken aloud in the valley for generations. Her hands shook, not with fear but with reverence. Around her, those who had chosen her path stood silent, holding torches, knives, or offerings, bread, feathers, a lamb bound and trembling. Tonight, Marta said, we remind the earth we belong to it. Tonight, we feed what must be fed. And Alaric, he moved between them, his face unreadable. He watched Tom as one might watch a man walking into fire. He watched Marta as though she were a mirror of himself. To Lena, who crept from her father's hut with fear bright in her eyes, he said only, you are the thread between them. When the knife falls, when the cross cracks, you must not look away. The dawn came gray, lifeless. Mist clung to the fields. The chapel bell tolled once, then twice, 2 more deaths in the night. The valley gathered, drawn by fear more than command. Tom climbed the chapel steps, the wooden cross in his hand. His voice trembled but carried. Brothers, sisters, this is the hour. We stand with Christ, or we fall with demons. The plague has tested us, but the Lord's light will break the shadow. Do not be deceived by those who would spill blood for false gods. His words swelled like thunder. Some wept, clutching rosaries, nodding, desperate to believe. Marta stepped forward then, her followers fanning around her like a darker procession. The smell of herbs and ash clung to them. You call it false, she said, her voice sharp as flint. But where is your salvation? Tom, where are the children you promised safe in Christ's hands? Dead, buried, forgotten. Faith has not fed them. Faith has not saved them. The earth is older. The earth is hungrier. And only the earth can be appeased. The 2 voices crashed against each other like storm and fire. Shouts broke out. Mothers pulled children close. Men reached for axes and sickles. The valley trembled, not from wind, not from quake, but from the weight of its own fear. And then Alaric struck his staff against the ground. Once, twice. The sound cut through the chaos. Enough, he said, his voice carrying like iron. The plague does not wait. Choose. Now. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Audric, the ox keeper, stepped forward. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken. He held his son's body in his arms, small, limp, dead. He looked at Tom. You told me the Lord would spare us if we believed. He looked at Marta. You told me the earth would take what it was owed. His voice broke. Take him. Then, take my son. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Tom staggered back, horrified. Marta's eyes gleamed with tears and fire. She knelt, touching the boy's hair. The earth will remember this gift. She whispered words into the boy's ear, though he could not hear them, and motioned for him to be laid upon the soil. Tom cried out, blasphemy, desecration. He gives his child to demons. He raised the cross as though it were a sword, and his followers surged forward. Marta's answered with torches and knives. The valley erupted, axes struck, knives flashed. Fire leapt from torches onto thatch. The chapel bell rang wildly. Though no hand pulled its rope, the weight of battle itself shook it. Children screamed. Goats scattered. Smoke rose, choking the air. Through it all, Alaric stood unmoving, his staff rooted in the earth. His eyes glowed in the firelight, not with triumph, not with despair, but with something colder, recognition. As though he had always known, this was the only end. Lena found herself in the center. She saw Tom fall to his knees, blood streaming from a cut to his head, still clutching the cross as if it were life itself. She saw Marta raise the knife over Audric's son, her face lit with both sorrow and devotion. And she heard Alaric's voice inside her, not aloud, but in her mind. The thread must be cut. Which way will you tie it? Her body moved before her mind did. She rushed between Marta and the child, her hands outstretched. No, she cried. Enough. No more blood. The knife froze. Marta's eyes burned into hers, fierce, questioning. Tom's voice rose behind her, cracked and desperate. Stand aside, child. Let the Lord's fire burn them. The valley held its breath. And then, silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence before something vast. The wind stilled. The smoke hung motionless. Even the cries of the dying hushed. From the earth itself came a sound, a low, endless groan. as though the soil beneath their feet remembered every bone it had swallowed. The ground shook, the mist thickened, swallowing the trees, the fields, the sky. Shapes moved in the fog, not wolves, not men, but shadows taller than huts, faceless, endless. The plague had arrived in full. People fell where they stood, choking, coughing, bleeding. Others screamed and fled into the fog, never to return. Tom clung to his cross, praying louder than the groans, until the fog wrapped him and his voice was gone. Marta dropped her knife, staring into the mist with awe, whispering words no one understood. Alaric lowered his head, as if bowing before something inevitable. And Lena, she stood still, the child's cold hand in hers, her eyes fixed on the shadows. She did not pray. She did not chant. She only breathed, and in her breath there was defiance. The mist swallowed the valley. When dawn came, there was no village. The huts were ash, the fields trampled, the chapel a broken shell. The cross lay splintered in the mud. Marta's hut was gone. The well was filled with bones. No voices remained. Only one set of footprints led away, small and bare, pressed into the wet earth. They vanished into the forest, where the trees closed behind them, and the valley was silent again. Not the silence of safety, but the silence of memory, of something finished.